Right, I'm going to take a glass of water. So, first I'm just going to quickly introduce what I think this debate is about. Briefly, to kind of introduce what I think a couple of themes could be. So, for one, obviously the internet, everyone loves it, everyone uses it, everyone gets a lot out of it from a business, personal and commercial and private kind of sense. But the question in my mind is, actually, has it really transformed the world around us, as many would like us believe? Or does it actually need to be, in other ways, reined in and even better policed? So have we overhyped the internet, or even are we being too gloomy about its prospects? So, for example, there's a writer for the FT called Martyn Perks, who recently quoted Robert Gordon of Northwestern University, who's just written a recent report on the fall in productivity in many Western economies, and both concluded that compared to other general purpose innovations or technologies from many other kind of previous industrial periods, such as sanitation, the combustion engine, the railways to electricity, they asked really, in comparison, has the internet had enough or as much effect in our lives, in our social and economic development? To make the point, Professor Gordon asked in his own research, he said, well, you know, if you had a choice, if you could keep either the brilliant devices invented since 2002 or, in comparison, running water and running water and even lavatories, what would you choose? You know, would you choose all the technology we've had in our lives since 2002 or all those other basic technologies such as sanitation, electricity and the combustion engine? And the conclusion for him and Martyn Perks was probably be no. You'd keep all the more fundamental innovation technologies rather than what we've had so far with the internet. So it's quite a sort of stark contrast, and maybe unfair, but it kind of makes you question, perhaps, have we seen enough of the internet to kind of really have transformed our lives over and beyond just being a very good sort of innovation in communications, but everywhere else in our lives, has it made a real fundamental difference? And then on the other side of the sort of scale, as it were, of course, the internet has made the way we communicate with each other change in many, many ways. But of course, right now we're seeing a real sort of proliferation of people wanting to regulate the internet, to censor people's actions, and to make people more conscious of what they're saying in public between one another. So of course, we've seen many cases of Twitter, Facebook, where people are, being jailed for encouraging other people to meet up and riot. On Twitter, people making jokes about bombs going off in airports who get imprisoned. Of course, many other instances where people using Twitter, for example, to make racist jokes around footballers who also get jailed for, say, 56 days. Now, what's going on there? Is this the kind of the dark side, the wild west of the internet? And does it mean that we need to regulate and police it more? Or is there, should we have an equally growing sort of cacophony, shall we say, arguing for more free speech online? So, in one sense, we're potentially underhyping the internet or even overhyping it in terms of what its potential could be for us. But the other way is that we are getting more and more calls from the authorities and other people themselves as private individuals to actually regulate it further. So, in a sense, trying to draw out some of the battle lines we're faced here about the future of the internet rather, not an intranet, where do you sit, where do you stand? So that's kind of where I wanted to kind of start off and pose the debate to you all tonight. And now we can listen to each of our speakers in terms of how they want to respond to that. So first off, Norman, how do you respond? I need to pass the microphone.
Well, thank you, Martyn, and good evening, everybody. I thought for a minute when Martyn began that we were going to get that Life of Brian kind of moment. What's the internet ever done for us? And then somebody from the audience would say, well, it's given us Facebook. And somebody, and I won't go through, the routine. I think by way of introduction to what I want to stress this evening, I just want to make one general point to begin with, and that is that I don't think we should have a fetishized discussion about the internet. I think the internet is a tool. It's a collection of technologies that has produced a certain capability, both in terms of what it can do with respect to communication, what it could do with respect to the collection of data, and giving rise to numerous possibilities. I think the real debate that we need to have is not so much about what has the internet ever done for us, but why is the internet viewed in the way that it is today, and is what we are seeing really its full potential, or could we envisage a different use, or envisage different uses of the internet for the future, and how could its impact perhaps be changed? And that when I thought about this, about the battle over the internet, the thing that bothers me the most is that I think that what we are going through at present is we have a technology that has enormous potential because of the ability it brings to bring people together, the level of cooperation. If you could collect 1 billion or 2 billion people where they could collaborate, where they could exchange ideas, where they could communicate, I think everything is possible from that basis onwards. But I think what we are suffering from is not that the technology doesn't have the potential, but our society, our cultural moment or our political moment, is that we have very low expectations about what this technology is and what it could be used for. And that, to me, is the biggest problem that we have. And it's something that prefigures the internet, and in fact is part of the kind of cultural moment of which the internet itself has now become a part and is helping to reproduce. And what I mean by that, just to demonstrate what I'm talking about, is I want to talk a little bit about Facebook and about social media. Because I think if you look at where all the excitement is and where all the focus is around the internet, I think it's around Facebook. It's around social media, it's around social networking, and for good reason, in the sense of a company that hardly existed 5-6 years ago, to then have an IPO that was heralded as the largest technology IPO in American history. You have to ask yourself, why is it that there's so much excitement around a service that essentially, if you think about what it is, it's not selling you anything. It's you and me. It's us. It's our data. It's really what it is it's a service that's built around self-absorbed consumption, self-reflection, almost like therapeutic communication, where we have to tell the world what we think, and other people can like it, and we can gather friends, and we can feel good about ourselves, and we can present ourselves to the world in a particular way, in a very manufactured fashion. In other words, what I'm getting at is this, that if you look at the largest technology IPO in history, is one that is based around therapeutic communication and self-absorption, rather than a technology that's going to transform the world, that's going to create new energy sources for us for the future, that's going to find a cure to cancer, that's going to unlock the human genome, that we could develop personalized medicine for the future. It tells me something, well, it suggests something to me, that we're in a particular moment in history, culturally and politically, where that's all we can really, that's what we're focusing upon when we talk about the internet and we talk about its potential. And I think that is a real problem. And that's one I think we need to try and examine a bit and understand. The thing that really struck me is if you recall, about a month before Facebook's IPO, Facebook purchased Instagram. Does everybody know what Instagram, the photo app servers? Oh, very interesting. One, because Facebook itself didn't develop that itself, given that photos were so central to Facebook's evolution. If you think about where it came from, where Zuckerberg couldn't get laid one evening, came back and created the service about sharing pictures on Harvard University. They didn't develop that themselves. They had to go and purchase that. But more importantly, what is Instagram? It's a photo sharing application that basically makes your pictures look like your grandfather took them. Okay, so it's kind of like nostalgic looking back, right? This kind of, not even looking forward. And at the same time that they paid $1 billion to Instagram, Kodak went into receivership. Now, I don't know if you know about Kodak, but Kodak was not just that little thing that, you make your holiday snaps. Kodak was an extraordinary company in terms of the innovation that they introduced. Kodak, through things like microfilm and X-ray, transformed the medical field. They transformed business. that transformed banking, transportation. They were the people whose cameras were on the moon when the Apollo 11 astronauts stepped out onto the moon, that could take pictures of grains of sand that could be sent back to Earth to analyze that. In other words, this was a company who helped to transform and make society that much more productive. What we have instead is we have a service, Facebook, the internet has come down to this, that it's more important to have a beautifully designed device, and I love this phone. It's more important to update your status on this than it is to update your knowledge about the world and how we can use this technology to become more productive, not more consumer. That's my concern. I think that's what we really need to focus upon. Thank you.
Thank you, Norman. Okay, Mindy.
I like that phrase, therapeutic communication, by the way. That's good. I want to start with a quote, quite a long quote. To satisfy a prurient taste, the details of sexual relations are spread broadcast in the columns of the daily papers. To occupy the indolent, column upon column is filled with idle gossip, which can only be procured by intrusion upon the domestic circle. The intensity and complexity of life, attendant upon advancing civilization, have rendered necessary some retreat from the world, and man, under the refining influence of culture, has become more sensitive to publicity, so that solitude and privacy have become more essential to the individual. But modern enterprise and invention have, through invasions upon his privacy, subjected him to mental pain and distress, far greater than could be inflicted by mere bodily injury. Nor is the harm wrought by such invasions confined to the suffering of those who may be the subjects of journalistic or other enterprise. In this, as in other branches of commerce, the supply creates the demand. Each crop of unseemly gossip thus harvested becomes the seed of more, and in direct proportion to its circulation results in the lowering of social standards and of morality. Even gossip, apparently harmless, when widely and persistently circulated, is potent for evil. It both belittles and perverts. It belittles by inverting the relative importance of things, thus dwarfing the thoughts and aspirations of a people. When personal gossip attains the dignity of print and crowds the space available for matters of real interest to the community, what wonder that the ignorant and thoughtless mistake its relative importance. Easy of comprehension, appealing to that weak side of human nature which is never wholly cast down by misfortunes and frailties of our neighbors, no one can be surprised that it usurps the place of interest in brains capable of other things. Triviality destroys at once robustness of thought and delicacy of feeling. No enthusiasm can flourish, no generous impulse can survive under its blighting influence. That was written in the Harvard Law Review by Louis Brandeis and Samuel Warren in 1880 in a piece that basically defined our modern notion of privacy. And what I find quite interesting about this, what they wrote, is that it could be transposed to today and to the way the internet works, the way tabloid culture works, and sort of a lot of what people complain about the ills of modern society. What's interesting is this was written as a defense of privacy, whereas today we seem to be giving up more and more of our own personal privacy in order to sort of propagate that sort of culture. I do believe that the internet is an amazing tool. It's an amazing tool for communication, and it's provided people with an unprecedented access to information that they couldn't get easily before. But I think that the issue that we're faced with is the way in which we've actually chosen to present that information and to use it. There's so much garbage that's being uploaded to the internet at a rapid rate that it's very, very hard to separate out what's good and what's useful and what's even fact from everything else that's put out there. Communication and ideas happen faster, they're distributed more easily, and it's great in terms of when you're dealing with disaster, when you're dealing with emergencies, and you need to convey information very, very quickly. However, when it works badly, it can be quite dangerous. As we've seen recently, you get people inciting basically mob hysteria. You get misinformation being spread with no fact-checking taking place. And you have a situation where people build circles of influence, friends and networks, which basically reinforce their views. And even though it's so easy to go out and find an opposing viewpoint on the internet, people rarely do. So you get a journalist posting an article online that people disagree with, and you suddenly have this, incredibly vicious call to have the person fired from the internet. You could take Jane Moore as a probably bad example, posting something about Stephen Gately, right or wrong, printed in a newspaper, and the entire internet interrupted in a furor. 10 years ago, probably nobody would have even noticed. And it wouldn't have been offensive because there wouldn't have been anybody reading it for it to offend. Secondly, I think another issue that we have in terms of all of the information and the people and the control is that you've got several different competing interests which have allowed things to kind of, the lack of regulation to show and the lack of regulation to be an issue. You have an infrastructure that's owned by sets of private companies. You have the platforms that are owned by another set of private companies. And then you have governments trying to get in there and regulate, but often they're trying to regulate the flow of information that's being produced and stored outside of their own borders. So governments can't control it, and the companies that own the data have no interest in controlling it, because for them data is everything, and what they want is the data because they make a profit by sharing the data and encouraging people to continue to post more and more data. So it's in everybody's interest that this flow of information continues, that people give up their privacy rights and continue to post everything there is to know about themselves online. Should we strive to limit its impact and protect ourselves? In some ways, yes. I think privacy needs to be dealt with. I think people need to be educated, and we need to stress the importance of maintaining some level of privacy, because if we continue to give up our right to a private life, we also lose our individuality, we lose our ability to sort of go away and make decisions on our own, and you end up with mob rule, basically. Okay, and to wind up, I think the other issue I wanted to bring up was also the accuracy of information, which I suppose we can address later, and I shall leave it there.
Thank you very much, Mindy. So, Keith.
Again, thanks for having me. I think the first thing we should establish is we should separate a few things out, because it's very hard to have a discussion where you're mixing the internet as a tool in with a conversation with the impact of the internet on people, and then the different ways different people choose to use it. And they're all really very separate things. So I think let's start with just acknowledging that as human beings, we've always produced tools that the goal of which, if they're successful, is to enable us to do things we want to do anyway. Going all the way back in human history, whether it's to kill animals, or whether it's to sow fields with seeds, or whether it's to pump steam through engines, we've always sought to invent things that enable us to achieve goals that we have anyway. And it's fairly clear that if you measure the internet by its impact on our ability to communicate, to broadcast, to be entertained, and probably 20 other things, it's an incredible tool, just standing alone as a tool, forgetting any moral judgments about how it's used for the time being. And if you compare, the ability we have today to be heard around the world and to be heard by lots of people to what it was prior to the internet, there's just no comparison. I think the second part of that is to recognize that the internet as a word kind of freezes it as if it is a thing that doesn't change. And in fact, the internet, there's been at least 3 internets since the mid-90s. We're probably entering the 4th one now. The first internet was an internet of portals. We went to Yahoo, we read stuff that other people published, and we used it for email and stuff like that to communicate. And the second internet, which Norman characterized as Web 2.0, was the internet of applications and services running in, quote, the cloud and being consumed through a browser like Gmail or Google Drive or WordPress, where the tools were not just about going somewhere to read, but now we could all become publishers. That was the second internet, and that internet still exists. The third internet was the internet of social media, where we all became publishers, and we chose to join services that enabled us to be publishers on a much bigger scale. And Facebook, and I agree with a lot of Norma's points about it, nonetheless should be recognized as a massive platform that enabled people to keep doing on a greater scale and with greater regularity things they are already doing and wanted to do. Right back to meeting people's houses and listening to records together. It's essentially human at its core, much as there might be things about it we dislike. And the fourth internet that's emerging now is, if anything, the inversion of the previous three. The previous three were all about centralized organizations. Yahoo in the first one, arguably Google in the second one, Facebook, LinkedIn, and others in the third one. The fourth internet's the mobile internet, where we all carry around with us in our pockets an incredibly powerful device that has all of our contacts on it. No need to give them to Facebook to manage for us. They're right there in the phone. It has a camera. It has the ability to record video, audio. It can send that stuff either privately or publicly anywhere in the world at a moment's notice. And it really is a massively empowering device for the individual to choose what they want to do with it, which would include all of the things they did in the previous three internets and more besides. So they're very different internets. They're not the same thing. And the fourth one is arguably the antithesis of the other three. So if there's things we don't like about the other three, it's possible this fourth one fixes a lot of those things, especially the distribution of power, which is really about software being in your hands on your device rather than on someone's servers in the cloud and you being a customer of it, if you like. So I think as a tool, I would argue that I don't think it needs defending, and I don't think its impact needs to be compared to toilets. I'll choose toilets too, but I don't think we need to make that choice. And I think that stands alone. I think the second thing is to recognize that the internet didn't grow up in a time of its own choosing. It grew up in the post-Reagan Thatcher era when collectivism, which had been dominant in the post-war years, was replaced by individualism. And we all were encouraged not to join movements and act together, but to go to college, get degrees, be good at what we choose to do, and be recognized for it by our peers, and to make progress in society, not by questioning society, but by being good at being part of it. And that individualization, often called postmodernism, made us all feel better as people because it was about us. And that happened simultaneously with the internet growing up. And the internet as a tool certainly encouraged that atomization and lack of society, that kind of antithesis of being together all part of the same thing. It certainly did do that, but at the same time it created instruments of collective organization and power, and it's up to each individual how they used it. And it isn't the internet's fault that it grew up after Thatcher and Reagan and the impact that they had. It just so happens. And that's a societal problem. That isn't an internet problem. I've only got about 30 seconds left, so I'll shut up now, and hopefully that's controversial enough and we can talk about some stuff.
All right, thank you, Keith. So last up, Maria.
As our chair mentioned in his introduction, Martin Wolf, writing in the Financial Times, suggests that the internet hasn't had as much impact on our overall social and economic development as other general purpose technologies. So he compares electricity, sanitation, running water, and goes as far as to say that today's information age is full of sound and fury, signifying little. I take issue with the assumption that we might want to measure the success or the impact of the internet in terms of its effect on economic growth. Indeed, arguably, we need to move away from considering economic structures that demand constant growth as being the be-all and end-all in a world containing finite resources. The true impact of Gutenberg's printing press can only really be viewed in retrospect and from a significant distance in time, one that we measure in decades or centuries, in fact. I think that the true impact of the internet won't be seen in our lifetimes. I don't think we're able yet to recognise what it has the potential to do. What we do know is that the internet has reached almost saturation point in Western societies very, very quickly. The rate of change in the way that we interact with applications on the internet, we use mobile technologies, people using them all around the room as I'm speaking, has changed considerably since the internet first was introduced. The primary activities that we undertake on the internet have changed significantly over time already. And we don't really know what will be the primary things we'll be using the internet for in 2 or 5 or 10 years' time. Often, it's the unintended consequences that can sometimes have the greater impacts. So, for example, the inclusion of SMS messaging on early mobile phones, the inclusion of the hashtag on Twitter. Neither of those were designed in as being what would be quite significant ways in which we use them, but actually they've really influenced their take-up. So I think it's rather too early for us to dismiss the potential of the internet to transform society. But I think perhaps that we ought to acknowledge that it's maybe the fear of some of the potential impacts of the internet that are partly responsible for the drive towards greater regulation. And the proposals for regulations that might influence how we are able to utilise it. When I was thinking about things that we could talk about here, there's a whole range of proposed regulations that be possible to start to discuss. The kind of discussions around net neutrality, the proposed communications bill, ACTA, and so on. But I've decided that perhaps it'd be more sensible to concentrate on the hard evidence that we do have about the interaction between the criminal law and social media postings. In 2003, we saw the introduction of the Communications Act, which included Section 127 that prohibits a person from sending, by means of a public electronic communications network, a message or other matter that is grossly offensive or of an indecent, obscene, or menacing character. That act was introduced at a time when electronic communication was generally directed at a specific individual. And the ability of individuals to broadcast using something like Facebook or Twitter to the general public had not really been properly realised. But if we fast forward to 2012, we have cases like the one last month where a 20-year-old has been sent to prison for 12 weeks for posting offensive and derogatory comments about the missing 5-year-old April Jones on a Facebook page. The judge in that case said that the reason for the sentence is the seriousness of the offence, the public outrage that has been caused, and we felt that there was no other sentence this court could have passed which conveys to you the abhorrence that many in society feel this crime should receive. Earlier in the same day, the Evening Standard reports that the same bench fined a man £100 for shouting racial abuse to a woman who'd pulled up in her car beside him. So there's quite a discrepancy there between the way in which we treat offensive communications face-to-face versus using the internet. I think that in the internet we have a very powerful tool that makes it easier for society in general to hold those in power to account. It gives us the ability to access data much more easily. It facilitates the organisation of discussion, and it facilitates the organisation of groups that might be able to take the opportunities it provides. And it does all of that despite the efforts of different authorities around the world to suppress it. Its very nature and existence means that we still don't quite know what are the opportunities that it presents to us. So I think that we should challenge proposals that regulate the internet so that we can retain the ability to hold people to account.
Thank you very much, Maria. So for the next sort of 15 or so minutes, I just want to have a kind of a brief panel discussion so that the panelists can sort of take up each other's points if they so wish. And I'll throw out a few kind of questions as well, I suppose. You know, so in terms of like Norman, what you were saying about, you know, we're living in a sort of a kind of a moment of sort of low expectations, I guess, where things like Facebook kind of crop up. And as they do, they're, you know, Facebook is obviously widely used, but as you say, is very unproductive. You know, what do you think that we can sort of do otherwise to sort of encourage a more sort of productive use of sort of technology or internet-related technologies? Because in my mind, some people argue that there is a lot of very interesting, productive sort of application of sort of internet-based sort of technology where we can sort of crowdsource ideas and encourages a much more sort of amateur approach to sort of, you know, innovating, shall we say. Do you sort of support that? Do you think that is equally positive, or would you argue for something else?
How long have I got?
Couple of minutes.
Well, I think it's a very difficult question to answer, because the problem, I think Keith made a very interesting point, that we've got to some extent separate the kind of technology from the broader social context in order to just to appreciate the technology in itself, but then also understand that there's an interrelationship between the two, which is very important. The problem I have with this discussion is that a lot of the problems that we have are actually unrelated to the internet. They're unrelated to the technology. They are cultural problems. They are problems of society that cannot be resolved technologically. That's would be my answer to your question, that there's no technological solution to these problems. The problem is the choices that we make and the change that we want to see are basically conscious human, they have to be conscious human decisions. And at the moment, you know, the conscious human decision making that we have at the moment is so fundamentally flawed, precisely because in the first instance, it's not that we have such low expectations about this technology. I think the real problem underpinning all of this is that we have low expectations about each other. We have low expectations about people and what people are capable of. So, for example, this point that was made about privacy, you see, I think to some extent, when we focus upon privacy and the internet, we force ourselves into a corner, into a discussion which in fact is the less important discussion about privacy, whereas in fact there's a much more important discussion going on about privacy which is unrelated to the internet, which I think has got to do with, for example, the fact that we now live in a society where everything has to be transparent. We have this deification of transparency, and why? You've got to ask yourself why. I think it's because underpinning all of this is this assumption that we are all flawed and what we do in private is all basically base, that there's something going on in private that needs to be exposed. And whether it's on the internet or not, the internet is absolutely incidental to this. This culture of this deification of transparency, I think, stems from a society that is uncomfortable with human beings, with what we do. And so what we've had, what is the biggest threat to privacy is not the internet, is the fact that we no longer have the distinction or in regulation, in government regulation, between what's private and what's public. And the squeezing of the public space, I think, has become, or the expansion of the public space into our bedrooms is now a bigger threat to privacy than anything the internet might do. Because in fact, on the internet, you have a choice. And I've got a lot to say about that, about, you know, what people share when they want to share and what they don't want to share when they fear that that data is not something that they have control over. So I think there's a very important debate to be had around that.
I mean, Mindy, how do you respond to that? And another thing I want to throw back to you is also that, you know, you sort of talk about people being able to can they kind of deal with what they sort of read online, if you like? Can they separate fact from fiction, as it were? The point I sort of would say to that is that, you know, I think individuals, we probably can work it out pretty well. But what worries me more so is that it's more the institutions and businesses and I don't know, people like the BBC or journalists who have more trouble about separating fact from fiction because of their perhaps lazy journalism. They don't do the story, they don't really do the research. And perhaps that's where that sort of myth comes from. So I wonder how you respond to that point, as well as what Norman asked you about the public space.
Okay, I mean, in terms of the public space, I wouldn't disagree that it's not just the internet, that I think it's a cultural thing. And I think part of that, to be honest, is the way in which democratic government functions, and this whole idea of how social control and how order and law is maintained within society. And that is down to society forcing itself upon people. That basically you watch your neighbor watches you, you see the people around you, and people are expected to behave in a certain way. And if people don't behave in an expected way, what we would, or behave in an antisocial way, then they get excommunicated from society. They struggle to get jobs, they don't make friends, they can't participate fully within the community. And it's one of the ways in which we function sort of in modern society, that you don't have someone breathing down your neck, batting down your front door and saying you shouldn't be doing that. But what you do have are your friends and neighbors kind of leaning on you to say, you know, you're dressed a bit funny today, or stop playing loud music, or really you shouldn't be thinking that, you should be thinking this, read this newspaper instead of that one. Foucault referred to it as something called governmentality, and it's the idea of how power is sort of exercised within society. And I think all of that is about, there is a struggle between the public and the private sphere. And what the internet has done is it sort of speeded up this whole process of everybody throwing everything into the public sphere. And I think a lot of it is because they're not thinking. What they see is fame is great. I want to be seen as popular. I want to be seen as powerful. I want to be seen as influential. And the way they do that is by building up giant networks and then posting everything about themselves onto the internet to try and achieve some modicum of fame. And as people compete with each other to become the next big thing, they do more and more and more outrageous things. They're willing to go further and further and further and put more things out there. And they don't think about the long-term consequences.
But could I just add to that, though, because sometimes, though, I think we do also need to have a sort of add a dose of realism here, because on the whole, whoever has a Twitter account, I think, uses it very rarely. And most people sort of, if anything, kind of listen or retweet. And I think the same is probably true of Facebook as well. That, you know, most people have Facebook, apparently so, but, you know, a lot less use it that frequently, for example. So, you know, do we not need to get more perspective on who is doing all this, letting it all out, as it were?
Possibly. I think you'd be surprised at what sort of data that is out there about you. I think you'd be very surprised. I mean, we Google every job applicant that comes through, and sometimes we find things that I think they don't realize that we knew. Forum postings that were made back in the 1990s when they were at university, random photos, because you're not always aware of what your friends are putting on the internet about you. That, okay, maybe I'm sort of exaggerating slightly, but when you think about what is no longer private, you do a search on Google. Google cookies your computer. It then passes on the data, in a lot of instances, to businesses in terms of what search terms you were looking for. Google knows what you've searched for, what you've clicked on, how many pages you clicked on when you went onto that website. If you've ever used Google Wallet, it has your credit card details. If you've used Google Latitude or Google Plus, it has, it has all of your data. So all of that information is out there, and your computer leaves a footprint, and that data is out there, and it's available for whoever sort of gets in there and gets it.
All right. I mean, look, Keith, you wanted to respond to that, and I'll ask you something else as well. But
Do you want to ask me something else so I can include it?
I'll ask you that as well. I mean, one of the things is, Keith, I mean, you know, you kind of retold the sort of the point about the internet is many things, and it's constantly evolving, which I entirely agree. But getting back to the original sort of crude thesis, shall we say, that we all obviously want lavatories, and it's a hardly good comparison to make. But of course, there has been many massive claims made of the internet and all the related technologies that it's tried to spawn. So I just wonder if, if there was anything, particularly meant in a forceful way of all that sort of claim at the time, or that was all just really hot air and we're now sort of, dealing with the consequences, as it were.
No, I'd say the opposite. I think the internet's positive impact is massively understated. And just take the example of iTunes University. I'll just pick one thing. Every single course at Stanford University is available on iTunes University with video, with the course notes, with the slides from the professors or the tutors, with the participation from the students. You can go and take the computer science course from Stanford University, which is probably the best in the United States, yourself for free, just through iTunes. You can look at every course at Yale. And I only know about the American universities. I'm pretty sure some of the British universities will be in there too in the UK iTunes. And just think of the next step, which is already happening, which is to turn those into actual courses that you can get a degree from. That's happening right now. Stanford has certified degrees that are entirely earned remotely via access to the coursework from the university. The impact of that is massive, is absolutely massive on the potential of education. Now, will everybody take advantage of that? Absolutely not. But that is a human problem. That isn't. The technology is making it available. The technology is making it available. I'm on the alumni board of the University of Kent in America. And the alumni board asked the University of Kent, why don't you put the courses online? And there's an absolutely paranoid computer science department at Kent that doesn't believe in publishing or broadcasting the content because they fear that students will no longer pay to go there. And so they have a very small-minded, commercially flawed belief that small is good, that keeping the content private is going to protect their income. And they're not making use of the opportunity to become a global university, which is really what they could do in a very short space of time. So that's just one example of a huge impact that education could have. I think one could give lots of other examples, but I want to talk about privacy because otherwise I'll run out of time. The key thing about privacy is what's the worst thing that can happen? The worst thing that can happen is someone can know the truth about you. All this stuff about it's all out there. Well, what is it that's out there? The truth. Well, how bad is the truth? Are you a bad person? Did you do something you're ashamed of? Did you do something that society would want to try to make you ashamed of, but actually privately you're not ashamed of it? The worst that can happen is the real you could be discovered. That's the worst that could happen. That doesn't happen, by the way. I mean, it isn't true that Google's data about what you searched is available to third parties. It is not available to third parties. It is not. That is key to their entire privacy policy. And I'm not a big fan of Google, but I will tell you, they do not and cannot share that data with a third party. They do know what you searched on because they're delivering the results to you, but they're not allowed to share it. So the real you actually will not be discovered, but it's worth just being sober for a second. That's the worst that could happen. Now, if you look at human beings, do you think most human beings are secretly terrible? And if you knew what they were doing on the internet, you'd discover how bad they are. Or do you think most human beings are actually genuinely quite nice and care about other people and just want good things to happen in the world? And if you knew the truth about them, that would be the case. Your answer to that question is about our perception of other people. And I think a lot of what we talk about the internet about isn't really about the internet. It's about our fears of other people and what they're doing that might harm us. And because we can see it more now, we're more aware of it. And so the root of it is an insecurity about each other. We don't trust each other. We might get diseases from each other. We might, have our identities stolen by each other. Those fears of each other lead to wanting to be protected. And as soon as you want to be protected, you get into this situation of wanting to put people in jail for what they said. And obviously, I've lived in America since 1996. You cannot put someone in jail for what they say. It is against the Constitution. It is not allowed. They can say anything they want, no matter how bad it is, and they are protected. It's a pretty good part of the American Constitution, and I'm not a big pro-America fan, generally speaking, but that is an awesome thing, because it means you can say anything you want. And most people will disagree with you if you say bad stuff. They won't be harmed by it. They're clever, they can listen, they have their own opinions, so you can be sure that they're not children, and if they are children, they've got parents who can explain the realities to them. So I think this fear of and the need to be protected is what underlies it, and that's a deep insecurity in ourselves about the future and about the world we live in.
Mindy, do you want to come back to some of those points?
I suppose my issue with privacy, and the big thing, it's not so much fear of being discovered. And it's funny because Eric Schmidt said something similar to you, which is that if you want to keep something private, it's because you probably shouldn't be doing it. I think it's a case of it being the choice of the individual about whether something is shared or not. And I think a lot of times people don't realize how public what they're doing is. And that, so it's almost like they're not actively making that decision. I think a lot of times stupid things people say on the internet are previously would have just been stupid things they said to their mates in the pub. And because they're being said publicly and they're not thinking about how they're being said publicly, that's when you get this sort of furor erupting, like that young chap that made a really ridiculous remark about Tom Daley, the diver. And he got death threats, and then he turned around and made a death threat, and he ended up getting hauled into the police station. Normally that's something he probably would have just said down the pub. He wasn't thinking it was public for the entire world to say, and I think that's wherein a lot of the danger lies, is people say stuff that's thoughtless, people say stuff that's stupid. They maybe don't mean any harm by it, but because it's public, it does have the capacity to harm them.
Okay. So, Maria, it's a kind of good moment to come back to you. I mean, because you know, you rightly sort of point out that there's a sort of growing encroachment in terms of, you know, more regulation, intrusion by the state, etc. Why is that happening, if you like, so forcefully? Because surely one of the ways to stop that is when, you know, we have a better defence of kind of free speech online. There are more advocates pointing out that, you know, what stays online kind of, you know, remains online, if you like. You know, so do you see there's a sort of an issue there that we haven't really created a strong enough sort of defence of free speech?
I think most definitely. What
how
we need to
bring
do
that about
is perhaps have a louder and more open debate about the need for free speech, and to perhaps just be a little bit more grown up about some of the conversation. I mean, Keith very kind of rightly points out that the law in the US is very different. You wouldn't be put into jail for making a comment, however stupid, on Twitter. And what you have there is a situation where society effectively self-regulates in terms of the way that people respond to and to deal with speech. I think because we have the possibility of a criminal sanction, then we're in a position where people have a tendency to kind of want to call for it to be applied. So I think perhaps we should be looking at whether or not we need to rebalance the way in which our laws sit more in favour of freedom of expression rather than in terms of the criminal law. But just to come back to some of the issues that were raised about privacy as well, I mean, the discussion that we should be, that perhaps kind of the issue with privacy is that, you know, the world might see kind of the true us is an interesting one. But what has changed as a result of the internet is that you know, there's a permanent record of who we used to be in terms of the kind of information that's recorded there. So whereas once kind of a teenager might be able to go out and do some stupid things and then grow up and get a kind of a real job, and all of those things would be in the memories of them and their friends and perhaps the odd photograph stuffed in a drawer, now those things live on the internet. I've done some very similar studies with students looking back to see what records exist of them on the internet. And similarly, we find all sorts of things going back to MySpace profiles that people had no idea still existed. So the internet does sort of change the balance slightly in terms of privacy because of that recording. But I don't think we need to regulate that. I think we need to educate people, perhaps.
Because pose this question to you as well, Norm, because isn't really the problem not the internet and what it reveals about you, but rather that you've got HR departments wanting to dig up your life from 20 years ago when you're going for a job about some innocuous career, and they're asking you what you did as a teenager. That's the most problematic thing of all, surely.
Absolutely. People change over time, and we need the ability to do that. We need the ability, to some extent, to forget the things that we've done.
I think that's a very fair point. I mean, I'd put it this way: if I was working for a firm that had an HR department that went and looked at people's profiles on Facebook and saw that, lo and behold, at the age of 18, somebody went and got pissed one night and ended up vomiting in the street. I said, no, I'm not going to employ that person. I'd fire the HR director. The first thing you want to say, if you have got employees who never got drunk when they were young, that would be more of a problem, in my book, because they're just not normal teenagers. So, what are you going to confirm that they're normal? Okay, fine. But I take your point. I mean, I think this is becoming ridiculous. But I just wanted to raise one other point, which maybe I'm going to broaden this out even further when there's so much on the table here that perhaps we shouldn't. But I do want to make one point, which to some extent is to add a little bit more to what Keith was saying earlier about the internet at the time of post-Reagan Thatcher era and all of that, and individualism and all of that. Because I think what a lot of people never really explain is where all this kind of social networking and everything came from. And it was definitely that it was a generation, it was young kids in particular, whose childhood had changed through, I would say, through the end of the 70s, but definitely in the 80s and the 90s, where they grew up in a society which was ring-fenced by risk culture. That, they couldn't do the kinds of things that you and I'm looking at some of the members of the audience, did when we were young, because kids in that environment were always under the supervision of adults in one form or another. And what really happened was, you made this point about SMS, about being an unintended consequence. You know where SMS came from? It came from kids in Japan using pages that used that to translate into a language that they could use, because paging they could get off their parents and was free. And the desire for texting came from young kids wanting to be able to communicate with each other. The whole impetus behind Facebook, but in fact behind MySpace before Facebook, came from a generation of children who gravitated towards the virtual space, because in that space they could create some autonomy for themselves, where they were no longer under the gaze of their parents. And that's where the whole impetus came from. And I think this is such an important point, because what the kids were doing was that they were solving their social problem, which was that they had nowhere where they could express themselves, where they could experiment in the way that perhaps we did when we were younger. Well, certainly I did. When I used to come home from school, my mother used to say, "Get the hell out of the house, I don't want to see you till dinner." Can you imagine if you did that now? Social services would be knocking on your door. This kid's running around the streets, this kid's, et cetera, et cetera. So what happened was that these kids found this technology. They were the ones, if you recall, about 5, maybe 10 years ago, there was always this discussion about how the kids always were demanding from their parents they wanted a mobile phone. They wanted why? Because if they had a mobile phone, it was something they had control over. They could get away. They developed texting and the language of texting so that their parents, even if they read what they were talking about, wouldn't understand what the hell they were talking about. And the parents couldn't understand, what the hell are you talking about? You've been with all your friends at school, and you come home and the first thing you do is you're instant messaging them and all this. And you've got 1,000 friends. Who has 1,000 friends? Ho, 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 you stupid children. And the whole point was, and I think you made the point earlier, or somebody made the point, that really what it was about self-expression, about gaining acknowledgement from your peers, of showing how popular you were, that you had so many friends, that you were in demand. It was about status, it was about identity, and they were playing with their identities. And that's why they never understood the implications of this, that they could let it all hang out, and that perhaps it would come back to haunt them. The real difficulty, ladies and gentlemen, this is something for you to think about, is that now what we seem to be doing is that all adults are behaving in the same way. So really what we're talking about here, and I think this goes back to the privacy discussion as well, it's about how society has become infantilized. And now we believe the reason why we are cracking down on free speech is because we don't believe as adults that we can handle when somebody says something offensive and we can just say sticks and stones will break my bones but words will never harm me. Now words have become these, weapons of mass destruction. And that really shows that we've all become diminished. And so the fact that we are all now on Facebook and we're all doing this, I would say it represents, again, it's the flip side of the cultural moment that I'm talking about, which I think represents the problem.